right. Because of all the conditions in the world today, with all the stuff that's going on with Russia, Ukraine, wars and rumors of wars and all of that, I'm going to do a brief video on the upcoming Gog Magog invasion, which I think is right at the doorstep. I think that it's the Gog Magog invasion that actually is the travail of the woman. It's the war that will take place in Israel before the child, which represents believers, you and me, hopefully, all of us, are caught up to God and to his throne. So we have to have the woman going into a travail. Travail is a war or an invasion. And I think it's going to be the Gog Magog invasion that the Bible talks about in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. There is a second Gog Magog war, and it's not the same one. Okay, the second war is going to be after the end of the millennium, after Satan is released, and he's going to conduct another invasion of Jerusalem. But the results of that war, the players in the war, the how the war ends, what happens immediately after that war, that second Gog Magog war is totally different than what we read about at the first Gog Magog invasion. Two different Gog Magog wars, part one and part two, like Gulf War I and Gulf War II, World War I, World War II. They're different. They're not the same thing. Now, I know that a lot of people who come to my channel believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, and I believe in a pre-seal, pre-trumpet rapture. I don't believe in a pre-wrath rapture the way people talk about that, or the way it's been taught in the pre-wrath rapture of the church. I don't believe that either. I believe there's more than one rapture, that Israel only has 3.5 years of that 70th week of Daniel, the first 3.5 years Jesus fulfilled at his first coming. So Israel only has 3.5 years left, and the events that take place before the abomination of desolation takes place, which is the beginning of that last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. The events that take place before that event are going to happen over a very, very, very short period of time. We're talking months here, not years. The only exception to that is the appearance of the two witnesses, or we should say the ministry of the two witnesses, because even though they're ministering, doesn't necessarily mean that we know they're here. It won't be till toward the end of their ministry that they actually have what I think of as a public ministry. I have a whole 60-page article that I've written on the two witnesses, explaining their ministry and all of that. So that 3.5 years that the two witnesses minister is not the same thing as the fulfillment of the first half of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, they happen to be here, but that does not mean that we're the 7 years of the 70th week of Daniel. I know that's a little perplexing, a little confusing, but the two witnesses don't fulfill the first part of the 70th week of Daniel. So all of that is in that publication that I'll leave a link to in the description box below. But let's take a look at the Gog Magog invasion. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, which are rather long chapters. I am not going to read the whole thing of either one of those. In fact, I am probably not going to read very much of them at all. The chapters are in this show notes handout that I have for you. It's a PDF. I'll link to that also in the description box below. You may want to go ahead and download that, and you can read it at your leisure. There's a couple of maps in there as well that will give you an idea of the locations that we're referring to when we use some of these rather archaic or Bible names for these different places. So what I'm basically going to do here is I am going to summarize my understanding right now of what I think about the Gog Magog invasion and how that will all play out. And just kind of as a, something I just want to bring up here. It seems like I need to share this every once in a while, is that what we're doing here is we're conducting an investigation of the Bible. This is a Bible study. I am not a prophet. I'm not prophesying anything. I'm just studying the Bible and trying to connect the dots as far as the different events that I see happening. Try to get everything to mesh without any inconsistencies. As soon as a new piece of information is put into this puzzle, well, then we have to rearrange everything all over again. So whereas a lot of people have their end time eschatology all tied up neatly in a bow, mine isn't. Okay, this is an ongoing investigation. A lot of people treat this as either a cold case, like we'll never know what the how to interpret this, or that they've already got it all tied up and they already know who the killer is, and they know who did it, and how they did it, and they're not open to any more information or any more clues or any more evidence. Okay, and that's fine. If that's you and you already got this all figured out, then you don't need to watch this video. Okay, if you want to treat eschatology as an ongoing investigation where God may actually be giving us more revelation or more connections in his word, I hope you'll continue to watch. So the Gog Magog invasion is something that's prophesied to happen in the latter days. That's what Ezekiel tells us, that it's in the latter days they will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which have long been desolate. So Ezekiel 36 actually talks about the regathering of the nation of Israel, about them being placed back in their land from out of many nations. And of course, that happened after World War II, when Israel was established as a nation state. It was a resolution by the United Nations to create, to partition off Palestine, creating a nation state of Israel, which then in May of 1948, they came into existence and declared their statehood. So Jews from all over the world were brought into Israel. There still are Jews or people of Israel that are scattered all over the world. They haven't all been brought back to this country, okay, of Israel. So there is going to be an invasion of Israel, of the nation state of Israel during the latter days. The name of the person, it's a symbolic name, it's just a prince or a chief, is Gog, okay, Gog. And Magog is the land that Gog comes from. He is a leader who is identified as the chief prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. So here's a map that you can take a look at. There are a lot of maps that identify these names, and they're all basically similar, that in that Meshech, Rosh, Tubal, Magog, all of these are to the north of Israel. That's the big deal here, is that these nations are to the north of Israel. The second big deal is that Gog is the one who is leading this alliance or confederacy of nations, and he is the one who is a guard for them. That means that whoever is ruling, whoever is the Gog, is the most powerful person, has the most powerful country of all of these nations, and is the one who is actually guarding them, that is preserving them, watching out for them, sort of like a mother hen watching over her chicks, okay? And there are a lot of people who think that Turkey is Magog, or that it's the leader of Turkey who is going to be the head of this alliance. But Turkey is not a guard for any of these other nations. Let me read you this passage in Ezekiel chapter 38. We'll read 1 through verse 8. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I'm against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I'll turn you around, put hooks into your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, which is modern-day Iran, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all of its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. That is, there's going to be a lot of people who are with you. Some of them might not even be named. Verse 7, prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. And after many days you'll be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you. So the other thing we learn about this is that they come on the mountains of Israel, which means that the mountains, which are basically the Golan Heights, had to be a part of Israel. Okay, they had to be regained by Israel, and that's what happened during I think it was the 6-day war. They regained the Golan Heights, and they still possess. Israel still possesses the Golan Heights to this day. It's disputed territory, but here it's called the Mountains of Israel. There is a chief prince, someone referred to as Gog, who is a guard for the nations. Now, this sort of came to my awareness when just a few weeks ago, there was a coup, an attempted coup happening, I think it was in Kazakhstan, and I think people were trying to foment another color revolution like it happened in other places. And the government of Kazakhstan asked Russia and Russian soldiers to come in and put that down. And so they did. Russia is a guard over these other countries, and many of them were allied with them or part of the Soviet Union. So Russia is a guard for these other nations. The idea that Turkey is Magog or the leader of Turkey is Gog, I think is erroneous. I don't think that Turkey is a world power or has the ability to gather these nations or the ability to protect them. But Russia does. Russia is also to the far north. Russia is associated with Rosh, with Meshach, and with Tubal, as we can see on this map, which I didn't do. I got this off of the internet. Basically, the idea is they're to the north, and I think we can identify them because Gog is going to be the one who guards all these nations. So in addition to the specified name groups, there's going to be other countries involved in this as well. And other nations that may join this invasion of Israel will be there because of alliances that they already have with Israel. So, for example, Syria. Russia is in Syria. Iran is in Syria. Iran has proxy nations. Iran has proxies in Lebanon, has proxies in Yemen, and also in Gaza. So these nations all are allies of one another. They're not necessarily named, but they, I think, should be included in whenever this invasion happens. These people who hate Israel are not going to just be watching what goes on. They're going to get involved and get a piece of the action as well. The ostensible reason for this invasion from, Gog's point of view and his allies is going to be to acquire wealth. And that's in verse 12 of Ezekiel 38. To take plunder and to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against a people gathered from the nations who've acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. So Israel has huge natural resources, huge supplies of natural gas and rare minerals, and it's the nation that exports fruits and vegetables all over Europe. There are a lot of pluses to having the nation of Israel in your back pocket. There's a lot of things there that people want. And the reason for the invasion is to collect these spoils. Now, there are other people who want to invade Israel or to have a war with Israel, and it's not about the resources. It's about the fact they want to wipe Israel off the map. They don't want her as a nation. And we read about those people in Psalm 83. And we also learn from Isaiah 17 that Damascus will cease to be a nation. Of course, Damascus is in Syria. Syria has alliances with Iran and with Russia. And because of that, Damascus will be wiped out. And it says in Isaiah 17:17 that it's God that who's going to be the one who sets fire to Damascus. Verse 17 of Isaiah 17, and I will set fire to the walls of Damascus. Damascus will cease to be a city, and according to some things that I've read, Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. So it may be that the Gog Magog invasion is combined with the Psalm 83 war, those people that we read about there, as well as the Isaiah 17 destruction of Damascus. All of these things may happen at the very same time. Okay, I believe that all of these are the travail, okay, of the woman of Revelation 12. The woman of Revelation 12 is Israel. Travail is a war. When a woman goes into travail, she's all by herself dealing with the pain. Okay, she is the one who is the focus, who, has to deliver the child. The same thing is true here. Israel is the focus of all of these countries, whether it's the Psalm 83 Confederacy or the Gog Magog Alliance. Israel is the focus of all of this. Okay, we're not looking at, Israel and the United States or so on and so forth. We're looking at all of this coming down to one nation. The focus of it is on Israel. And isn't this interesting? To me, it just shows how the Bible is so accurate in its prophecy. Who would have thought that Israel would have been regathered from the nations? Who would have thought that the Jews would have maintained a separate identity for, 2,000 years, basically? Who would have thought that they would have their own country and that it would be such an important country, even though it is so small, that huge nations will want to get the resources from it? And so much animosity basically from the Muslim nations that surround Israel, that they will want to see her done in. Okay, so when we talk about travail, the Bible, especially the book of Jeremiah, talks about men having their hands on their belly like women in travail. Okay, that their travail is when an overwhelming force comes against the nation of Israel. So how does the Gog Magog invasion end? Well, Israel is unable to defend herself, and there is nobody else who's going to come to Israel's rescue. And we're going to talk about that in another video. World powers are going to collapse, leaving Israel vulnerable so that she has to basically stand all alone without any protection from anyone, not even the United States. This is how that invasion ends, though. It's the Lord. The Lord is going to bring that invasion to an end by an earthquake in Israel. And I'm also linking to a YouTube video that talks about how Israel is primed for a 7.5 earthquake that should be coming any day. And we also have had a couple of significant earthquakes in Israel in the last couple days. And did you know that part of the mountains of Israel are volcanic? They're old volcanoes. There's a lot of geothermal activity that goes on in that part of the world. And in fact, the Great Rift Valley that goes up from Africa through the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, and all of that is part of a very, very, very large fault line. Now, the Lord is going to cause an earthquake to happen in Israel. There's going to be flooding rain, hail, fire, and brimstone, and the combatants are going to start fighting one another. Okay, God is going to turn them against one another. And a lot of these people who are part of the Gog Magog Alliance are not naturally like friendly with one another, but it's a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And eventually, when they are being bombarded with God's weapons, they will turn on one another as well and kill one another. The Lord brings the Psalm 83 war to an end, basically through the same thing, through torrents and flooding rain. And the destruction of Israel's enemies at that time is compared to the defeat of Sisera during the days of the judges. And in Judges chapter 5, there is the psalm or Song of Deborah, where she recounts how that battle was won, and it was through an earthquake and torrents of rain. So there are patterns here of the same kind of destruction happening for the Gog Magog invasion, the Psalm 83 war. Okay, and we know from the alliances that Russia is part of Syria, Iran is a part of Syria as far as allied with them, and that as a result of some of that, the punishment or the way God ends the war will also leak into Syria, and Syria will be destroyed. Actually, Damascus will be destroyed. There is a purpose to God being the one who delivers Israel in this case, and it's a supernatural delivery. Okay, and interesting that the woman is going to be delivered too of a child. But this deliverance that occurs is as a result of God coming to Israel's rescue. And there are three things that are associated with the reasons why God is going to allow Gog Magog to come down. And principal person, Gog, who I believe is whoever is the leader of Russia at that time, is reluctant to invade. Okay, and this is why God has to turn them around, put hooks in their jaw, and make him come down to the lands of Israel, because this is not something that is part of the original plan for Gog, the leader of Russia, the leader of Magog, this is not something that was part of his plan, but God is going to put it into his heart. These evil thoughts, or they're going to come into his heart somehow or another. God is going to orchestrate this so that he comes down and invades Israel. And when we see that invasion, that's how we know that we're about to be raptured. Okay, because that is the war or invasion that's going to focus on the nation of Israel. So here's the end result of God's deliverance for Israel. Number one, God says this. He says that the nations would know that he's God. Okay, that's really important to God. He wants the nations to know that he is God. And we read about that in chapter 38, the second half of verse 16. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me. And also down in verse 23, thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. And also in Ezekiel 39, second half of verse 7, then the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. It's important to God that the nations know that he is God, that he is the Holy One of Israel. The second thing that God wants is for Israel to know that he is the Lord. Okay, and that's in verse 22 of chapter 39. So the house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward. And the third thing is that this is going to be the opportunity that God uses to pour out his Spirit on the house of Israel. And that's down in verse 29 of Ezekiel 39, and I will not hide my face from them anymore, for I shall have poured out my Spirit on the house of Israel. Now we know that after the woman goes into travail, that there's a male child that's born, okay? And there's 7 days during which a male child has to be kept with its mother. It'll be circumcised, it'll be named, and it will be redeemed, presented to God on the 8th day. Okay, it's not for 7 days, the child is pretty much status quo. Also, there is a giving of the Holy Spirit that's going to happen over the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a 7-day feast. So, and then there's an 8th day at the end of that 7-day feast. So it ties in really well with the birth of a child, 7 days with its mother. This includes any male animal that's the firstborn before it can be offered as a sacrifice or an offering. The animal has to spend 7 days with its mother, and then it can be presented as an offering on the 8th day. Same thing here, 7 days with an 8th day at the end. I've done some Bible studies on that in the past. By the way, what I'm doing here, just to emphasize this again, is I'm doing a Bible study. Okay, this is not prophecy. I'm not a prophet. I'm looking at the Bible and trying to make sense of it. Let's put it that way. Trying to interpret it, to make sense of it, and to, understand what it says, and to also help other people to rethink maybe what they believe about the Bible and prophecy in the end times. After the war is over, after the invasion is over and God has put everything to an end, it says that God is going to send fire on Magog. And I believe that's Russia. He's going to send fire on Russia. And what that effectively will do is make it so that Russia is no longer a world power. All world powers have to fall before the beast begins to reign, with the exception of China and the 10 kings, which I believe the 10 kings are Islamic nations in the old Roman world. Islam and China are going to be the military arm of the beast. All other world powers have to collapse. That includes the United States, it includes Russia. So Russia will collapse as a world power when God brings this invasion to an end and when he sends fire on Magog. He's also going to send fire on the coastlands, and that's usually considered the coastlands of the Mediterranean, probably Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and that may be the fire that God pours out on the city of Damascus. Russia will cease to be a superpower at this time, making way for the rise of Islam and the 10 kings, the kings of the East, which are China and her allies. In my thinking, it's highly likely that this invasion will be the fulfillment of the sign of the dragon in Revelation 12, the travail of the woman, who is Israel, the birth of the child, which is us, and the subsequent rapture of believers to the throne of God. The focus of this war, the travail, is Israel and no other nation. She'll be attacked on every side with no help, and only God will be able to save her. It's at the culmination, the end of this invasion, that the child is born. That is, that firstborn believers are identified and remain here on the earth for 7 days, and then are caught up, raptured on the 8th day. It's the day of presentation to God, and I'll do a video on this hopefully really soon. Some things have changed about my thinking about this, and so I just want to share with you how I'm seeing new clues unfold with regard to our rapture. And the last thing I want to talk about here is that the giving of the Spirit is connected with the end of the war or the invasion, that God says he's going to pour out his Spirit on Israel. We know that the first fruits of the Spirit are going to be poured out on the 144,000 of Israel. Okay, this is a symbolic number. I believe that it's during that 7 days that over the Feast of Tabernacles, that this group of believers, is new believers, the 144,000 of Israel, are going to be sealed in the Holy Spirit. That's what sealing is all about. It's about the giving of the Holy Spirit. On the 8th day, there is that second outpouring, which I believe will be the fulfillment, or a second fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. And by the way, I think Joel chapter 2 is going to have a third fulfillment in the recreation, the new heavens and the new earth. That's for another video as well. During the 7 days after God has defeated Gog, Satan will put his focus now not on the woman anymore, but on the child. It says the dragon will try to devour the child. To devour means to fight. There's going to be a war now between Satan and a third of his angels and the newly identified male child, that is believers, who are going to be used by Christ as he seals the 144,000 of Israel. Okay, remember, he's the one that carries the signet ring. He has the signet, and he says to the 4 trumpet angels, do not harm the earth or sea or trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their forehead. The we there, I believe, is Christ and these believers who are still here on earth until they're raptured on the 8th day. So there's going to be a time of really intense spiritual warfare that I think we as believers need to be ready for. After the Gog Magog invasion takes place, there's going to be 7 days of really intense warfare for believers, and then we will be raptured on the 8th day. So basically, that is my scenario. It's a, just sort of a thumbnail sketch of possibilities of things that may happen. I'm not saying that for sure these Psalm 83 or Isaiah 17 are going to happen, but I think it fits really well with what we see going on in the world today. And there is no reason why these have to be separate wars or invasions, confederations. They can all be working together at the same time for different purposes. Gog Magog, Gog is going to want to invade to gather spoil, but there's a confederacy of people who surround Israel who say, let's wipe her out as a nation. Different motivations. And then because Russia and Iran and different people are already in Syria, God is going to rain down fire on the city of Damascus. God is going to rain fire on the coastlands as well as on Magog. So Russia will be destroyed as a world power. And basically what we're having to see before the Antichrist can begin his 42-month reign is we have to have the collapse of every major world power, including the United States. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about, going to give you my ideas, my thoughts about how things may play out over the next few months with regard to Russia coming more powerfully on the world stage, the collapse of the United States as a world power, which I think will happen before the collapse of Russia, before the Gog Magog invasion. I think the United States will be basically the next domino to fall in terms of world power. So we'll talk about that on the next video. Till then, I pray you'll have a very, very blessed day.